Okay. Can you hear me? No. That's... No. Okay. It works. Okay. Obviously, the V sign represent universal sets, which here is meant to be a model of first order ZFC. Okay. So there is a very precise notion of what I mean by universe. Okay, as is well known, assuming that first order ZFC is consistent, the question true V or not true V is about whether or not there is such a thing as the universe of sets which our formal system, namely first order ZFC, is intended to describe. Now, here is a case in which faith and persuasion make their presence felt in mathematics. Why faith? Well, because, as I said before, we must assume that first order ZFC is consistent. Why? This is simply a matter of assumption. Well, because we know that one of the consequences of Gödel's second incompleteness theorem is that if first order ZFC is consistent, then we cannot prove this fact within first order ZFC. So basically we have to accept, we have to assume that this formal system is consistent. Okay, but our faith is not blind. There are some justifications for it. And some of the strongest justifications are provided by the fact that first order ZFC disposes efficiently of the known set theoretical paradoxes. Efficiently, by disposing efficiently of the paradoxes, I mean is able to get rid of the known set theoretical paradoxes in such a way as not to kill mathematical activity, as instead it did Russell's, for instance, ramified theory of types. So, but this idea somehow belongs to, in a sense, to rhetoric, to persuasion. Well, up to this point, we have shown that the non-paradoxes are not something which can be given within first order ZFC, but nobody tells us that someone tomorrow might find a new paradox showing the inconsistency of first order ZFC. So, although we have strong grounds in order to believe, in order to assume that first order ZFC is consistent, yet we are not in possession of a proof for that. So this is, in a sense, some kind of rhetorical argument which persuades us about the truth of a particular thesis, but is not a proof of it. Now, true V or not true V, it means, as I said before, is there an intended universe of sets or not? And this is a dilemma for the realist, basically, because for the anti-realist, I mean, for a formalist or for a constructivist, but for the formalist, there is no question about models of mathematical theories. Why? Because he believes that mathematical theories are just games that he plays with a particular formal system and with particular transformation rules. So there is no problem about models, about entities which are described, which exist independently of the mathematical activity, of the game being played, and which are meant to be described by the formal system. The same applies very much applies to the constructivist. Also for the constructivist, mathematical activity is not an activity of discovery of properties, of entities which exist independently of the constructive activity of the mathematician. And some brands of constructivism, in particular intuitionism, have been historically very hostile to formal systems. Even when Heyting produced his interpretation of the logical constants, Brouwer was not too happy about it, because for the intuitionist, formal systems just curb the freedom in the creativity of proof constructive procedures of the intuitionist. So basically, the dilemma I proposed as title of this communication is a dilemma, an important one, but exclusively for the realists. Now, let's try to see what happens, what we are committed to if we accept either of the holes of this dilemma. Well, if there is a true V, then we are committed to metaphysical realism about objects. What does it mean? Well, if there is a true V, then perhaps sets are well-ordered collections which are not too big. Okay? So the entities, the objects of mathematical investigations are objects of this kind. And indeed, there has been in the past a debate about believers in the true V. One of the best known debates is that which involved Quine on one side and Penelope Maddi on the other side. Quine asserting that the ontological commitment one should have towards a universe was leading basically to accepting Gödel's constructible universe, and therefore was a commitment which should have led to the acceptance of the axiom that V, the universe, equals L, namely the universe of Gödel's constructible sets. Maddi, on the contrary, although she agreed that there is a universe of sets, she objected against this too limiting idea that Quine had. But she thought that it might well be the case that the cumulative hierarchy, the von Neumann universe, which seemed to be in the minds of many set theoreticians as the intended universe, could also include large cardinals, some of which are incompatible with Gödel's axiom that V equals L. So basically, someone who accepts the idea that there exists such a thing as a true V is committed to being a realist about objects. But he is also committed to being a realist about truth. Why? Well, because if there is just one universe, and set theory is meant to describe the entities present in this universe and their properties, and so on, then given any closed statement belonging to set theory, this must be either true or false of our universe. And the truth is not relative because there is just one universe. And secondly, the truth of the statement transcends provability. So the statement is true even though we might not be able to prove it. Okay? Now, I don't want to go into questions concerning probability, constructive probability or not. Let's stay with this idea of general probability. So, for a realist about truth must not be relative to a particular universe, and secondly, must transcend provability. So a statement must be either true or false, independently of whether we are in a position to prove it or not. But let's see now what the believer in the non-existence of a truth V is committed to. Remember, we are talking about realist philosophers of mathematics. Okay, if there is no true V, then you as a realist are committed to a form of Meinonganism about objects. You will remember Meinon. Meinon believed that anything starting from the round square to the most amazing singular terms existed, and somehow distinguished between the existence, the being of an entity, and the existence of the entity itself. Well, I speak here of a form of Meinonganism because Meinonganism was incoherent, and it was well known to Meinon this. And the incoherence of Meinonganism was at the root of Russell's theory of definite descriptions. But in this case, the realist who is committed to the idea that there is no true V is Meinongian about objects. What does it mean? It means, to put it in a recent fashionable way with Balaguer, is a plentiful Platonist. Namely, he believes that any consistent mathematical theory or any consistent formal system of set theory individuates a particular universe, is true of a particular universe. In the second place, the person who is against the idea that there is a true V has got to be an anti-realist about truth, in the sense that truth is relative. So a statement like the continuum hypothesis is true, for instance, within Gödel's universe of constructible sets, but is false in some forcing models, okay? And there is no problem with him. I mean, he's quite happy with this. Now, but why do we have such a dilemma? What is at the root of the development of this dilemma? Well, there are two technical reasons. The first technical reason is that phenomenon involving formal systems known as independence. And the other one is a well-known theorem, the Levinas-Skolem theorem. Now, the dilemma expressed by the assertion, the question, true V or not true V, is generated by the observation that if first order ZFC is consistent, then it has a plurality of non-isomorphic models. Okay? So some models in which the continuum hypothesis is true, other models in which the continuum hypothesis is false. So these models are not elementarily equivalent. Different things are true in different models. How do we know this? Well, we know this from the Gödel-Rosser first incompleteness theorem, which applies to first order ZFC. So we know from this theorem that if first order ZFC is consistent, then there must be at least one true statement belonging to first order ZFC, which is independent of first order ZFC. So we cannot prove it. And we cannot even prove, of course, its negation. So, of course, if we have a consistent system and we add a supplementary axiom, a sentence which is independent of it, we obtain an extension which is consistent as well. And so in this way, we obtain two consistent extensions of ZFC, adding in one case the continuum hypothesis, in the other case the negation of the continuum hypothesis, which are both consistent and which are not, the models of these formal systems cannot be isomorphic because they are not elementarily equivalent. So one reason why we know about the existence of these non-isomorphic models is Gödel's first incompleteness theorem. Another reason comes from forcing, from what Cohen did in the early 60s. He produced actually models of ZFC in which the continuum hypothesis is true and models of ZFC in which the continuum hypothesis is false. And the third technical reason is the very well-known Levenheim-Skolem theorem. So if first-order ZFC is consistent, as a model, well, and if the von Neumann cumulative hierarchy is a model of it, it's an infinite model, so it must also have a countable model. Clearly, a countable model cannot be isomorphic to such a huge thing as the whole von Neumann universe. So that's the other technical reason why we know that there are, under the assumption that first order ZFC is consistent, that's the other reason why we know that there must be non-isomorphic models. And now let's see some consequences of the dilemma which are not quite nice. Well, the first consequence, which is really difficult to accept, is that if we are believers in the true V, like Gödel was, for instance, well, Gödel, even after Cohen had shown that the continuum hypothesis is independent of the axioms of ZFC, Gödel prompted people to find new axioms which, in this case, were related to the existence of large cardinals, which might be hoped by being added to the system of Zermelo-Frankel choice to decide the continuum hypothesis. Nowadays, we know that this is not possible. No large cardinal axiom added to first order ZFC is able to decide it, but this is not important for what I'm trying to say. What is important is that Gödel's search for new axioms to decide the continuum hypothesis is a symptom of the idea that there is a true V, and we haven't yet discovered what the essential property of the intended universe is which might decide the continuum hypothesis. So, if, like Gödel, Quine, and Maddy, we are strong believers in the existence of the true V, then we must find very difficult to explain that perfectly legitimate mathematical practice which consists in developing, happily I would say, developing systems like ZFC plus continuum hypothesis or ZFC plus the negation of the continuum hypothesis. And the history of mathematics is full of these things. You know, the classical example mentioned by everybody who talks about this kind of things is the development of non-Euclidean geometries. Once it was discovered that the fifth postulate of Euclid, the postulate of the parallels, is independent of the other axioms and postulates of Euclidean geometries, mathematicians didn't simply stop at that and gaped at this type of situation. Quite the opposite thing. They tried to develop other formal systems, which eventually ended up in the construction of new geometrical systems. Bolyai and Lobachevsky with the hyperbolic geometry, and Riemann with the elliptic geometry. Now, so the true believer in the existence of true V is not able to explain that mathematical practice. On the other hand, if we do not believe in a true V, like, for instance, Balaguer or Hankins more recently, we find ourselves at a loss in an attempt to give a good foundation, a good set theoretical foundations for mathematics, because, for instance, we cannot solve Frege's scandal of arithmetic. You will remember that Frege's scandal of arithmetic was, and I quote from the Foundations of Arithmetic, the bits in square brackets are my own additions to the text, or alterations, and also the boldface character of some of the words, it's mine. Frege said famously in the introduction to the Foundations of Arithmetic, is it not a scandal that our science of arithmetic should be so unclear about the first and foremost among its objects? He was talking about the number 1, and one which is apparently so simple, number 1. Small hope then, we shall be able to say what number is. Okay? This is a scandal for Frege, and look, for him the problem is explaining the nature of an object. Okay? So mathematics is a science of objects for him. Why did I say that if we don't believe in the existence of a true V, we would be unable to solve Frege's scandal of arithmetic? Well, if there is no true V, then two different non-isomorphic models, P and Q, or even second order ZFC, may have two non-isomorphic sets of natural numbers. So the natural number, the axiom, even second order axioms of natural numbers, they would be categorical within each universe, okay, in which they are defined, but they might not be isomorphic from one universe to the other, okay? This is a very powerful result. Well, if this is the case, then what happens to our objects, to our arithmetical objects? What are natural numbers? What sort of sets are they? You know, it's impossible to come to terms with this problem. But, as I finish with this, there is a possible dissolution of this dilemma. Dissolution of the dilemma depends on what I call structural realism. So being realist in mathematics about structures. So mathematical theories are not sciences of objects, but they are sciences, if we like, of structures. Why this move would solve the problems, particularly dissolve the dilemma? Well, if axiom systems like first order ZFC plus various addition of axioms is consistent, and they do not describe intended objects, but very large general structures, there is no reason why we shouldn't look at set theories in the same way in which we look at groups or topological spaces. Namely, in principle, it is possible to formulate a theory of these large general structures which describe the structural properties of possibly non-isomorphic structure with one another. In group theory, this is exactly what happens. You know, there are finite groups, infinite groups, topological spaces. In topology, in general topology, is exactly the same situation. So, Moreover, if we adopt structural realism, we might be able to solve Frege's scandal of arithmetic in a way which was not thought by him. Namely, we could show that arithmetic, as Quine, I think it said, is all there is to number. Namely, what provides a good foundation for the concept of number is not the discovery of a particular object, which can play the role of number one, which is the number one, but the structure of which the arithmetical laws are true. Okay? And this, of course, this perspective would completely solve the dilemma, what I call the realist dilemma, but of course would pose a very serious challenge. What do we mean by structure? What do we mean? For instance, some people in the past thought that the term structure was only to be applied to what is described by categorical axiom systems. Then this cannot be the case. So we must find a different concept of structure, namely a structure which is not characterized by categorical axiom system, like we have, as I said before in the question I raised to a previous speaker, like we have in group theory. In algebra, not just groups, but also fields, vector spaces, and so on, are not, the theory of these things are not categorical. So I think that this is the real challenge that we have. If we are able to develop a good structural realism by modifying, by finding an acceptable notion of structure which cannot be understood in terms of what is characterized by categorical axiom systems, then we can get out of the dilemma in a positive way. Thank you.
Thank you. We took lots of questions.
Okay, I think I'll speak up. I think I have three separate concerns about your
hands up.
I have three separate concerns about your talk. The first one is about your equating Maddy's and Quine's conceptions with Gödel's. Because I think they're very different functionality. You say that if you are a metaphysical realist, then you have to divorce Quine's, Maddy's, and Gödel's positions. I think that Quinean Platonists, or say Maddy's naturalist, doesn't believe that it's not committed to the idea that there's a true being, but rather there might be a sort of axiomatization which works better than other because it has some specific enjoys some particular specific theoretical virtues, because it helps us do set theory in a very efficient way. It just makes Quine's Maddy's positions very apart from Gödel's. We believe that that's a true being because we have a sort of good intuitive grasp of the reality sets. So the second concern is about the. So in your first slide, I think you stated that if there is a true being.
May I address your first concern first,
okay,
because I'm going to forget about the other two otherwise. Now, Quine, Maddy, and Gödel. I think, in a sense, you answered yourself when you said that the quarrel between Maddy and Quine was about which is the best or which is the better formal system for set theory. Okay. Well, if there is the possibility of discussing merits like better and worse concerning which universe or which formal system we should adopt in order to do set theory, this can only mean one thing, namely that Maddy has in mind something very precise, has an intuition shared with Boudin and other people. And she thinks, because mathematical naturalism in her eyes means we should not use philosophy in order to adjudicate questions relating to mathematical methodology. This is what she means by mathematical naturalism. If you get rid of all sorts of other things which are not really essential, okay? But the fact that the adjudication of the open question has to be left to mathematicians and not to philosophers like Quine, who have this idea, that empirical science is what ultimately is going to justify the assumptions that we're going to make. The web of beliefs and so on and so forth. Okay, so Quine ought to naturally, to make a joke about naturalism and so on, Quine is bound to say that in order to develop natural science, it's more than sufficient Gödel's constructible universe. We don't need measurable cardinals, or even bigger cardinals than those, and so on. It's bound to do that. Maddy's reply to Quine is not, it doesn't matter whether there is a true V or not. No, Maddy's reply to Quine is, look, you are going, in a sense, against your own prescription about what an empiricist philosopher should be doing. Science natural, epistemology naturalized, and so on. The real naturalization, talking about mathematics, which we should be doing, is leaving it to the mathematician to do it, to decide which the true universe is. Okay? So all these principles, maximizing and so on, which she mentions in various books and publications and so on, are meant to do this. I mean, she has, in my view, quite a precise idea about what the true V looks like, and finds Quine's remarks too philosophical to her taste, and in a sense, remarks which seem to betray the reason why Quine, many years before, had talked about naturalized epistemology and so on.
I'm sorry, we have quite a few questions and quite a few minutes. Okay, Giorgio. So I was about to keep.
Okay,
Yeah, sure.
It seems to me at some point in your talk there's a shift from the foundation.
You said shift?
There's a shift from the foundation of the theory when you talk about V and about you actually to solve set theoretical problem, to the foundation of mathematics when you start talking about structures instead of objects. And for this reason, I believe that your solution may be a solution for a theory of model of set theory, but not for a set theory. In the sense that if you're talking about models of set theory, then you can say, okay, there are different models that you can consider as different geometries. But when you think about set theory and about the real V in some sense, what should be true about sets, then this is not, it cannot handle the solution.
Why not? I don't understand. I mean, the question is, I gave from the very beginning that definition of what a universe is for me, just to make clear that we were not just talking across purposes. So I said that what I mean by universe is a model of first order ZFC. Why do I talk about this in terms of universe? Well, because this is general talk for mathematicians. The von Neumann hierarchy, the big cumulative hierarchy, V, which begins, with the empty set and then and so on, is precisely a model of Z. You can prove it. You can go from axiom to axiom and just prove that all these axioms are true. If the axiom system is consistent and so on, of course, it is a big assumption we are making, okay? A very big assumption. And perhaps is one of the very big differences that there is between the present day attitude of mathematicians and philosophers towards models of set theory or universes, in my acception, and the attitude that the first geometers had towards non-Euclidean geometries. Why? There is a very important difference between the two things. Because geometers, at the time of the introduction of non-Euclidean geometry, thought that there was no doubt whatsoever about Euclidean geometry. That was the accepted law. That was the accepted idea. And the reason why they tried to find models, Euclidean models of non-Euclidean geometries, Beltrami, Klein, Poincaré, and other people, wasn't so much trying to give relative consistency proofs of non-Euclidean geometries with respect to Euclidean geometry, was the attempt to provide existence proofs. Namely, you talk about this, given a straight line on the plane and the point outside it, there are at least two straight lines passing for that point which are parallel to the given line. Well, how do we know whether this is an ad hoc? Like the epicycles with Ptolemaic astronomy. How do we know that this is just particular ad hoc assumption we are making? As soon as the mathematician provides the model, Beltrami with a pseudosphere and so on, a part of a pseudosphere is a model of that, and so on, then all the discussion ends. Why? Because the mathematician knows that there is something which shows that that assumption is not just an ad hoc thing. The present day situation is very different. Why? Because we already know that we cannot prove the consistency of those four axioms which belong to that formal system. So it's a slightly different setup altogether, but the idea still remains that a model of first-order ZFC merits to be called a universe because for a realist, any mathematical question that you can formulate meaningfully within first-order ZFC is determinately either true or false within that, independently of whether we know or whether we can show that that is the case. Okay.
I'm sorry, we're really out of time.
Okay.
We're not able to answer the question, so probably just one Neil.
We can talk about it later.
Stuart, you had a question? Andy?
Yeah, so I just wanted to press. I think I can.
Neil?
It's better with that.
That's by natural selection, Neil?
Next first.
Oh,
No, he can
Oh, you can speak.
Yes.
I thought you were nice.
So I just wanted to press you on the first point of the dilemma that you present for the realist. So the realist is, you never use this word, but the realist I take to be the person who thinks that there's a unique model of ZFC.
No. They are both realists. Both the person who believes in a true V and the person who believes that there is no they are both realists, okay? But they are...
Oh, okay. I think this reply still works. Okay, so this is for the first one. So I think there's still a good explanation of why people who study ZFC plus CH and people who study ZFC plus not CH are doing something legitimate. So in any kind of math, so we can have two orientations towards mathematics. One is one that everyone can accept, and that orientation states that mathematics has interesting applications. So, for example, even if you thought that mathematics was about a distinctively mathematical subject matter, so the natural numbers are about numbers, we're still not going to deny that arithmetic can have important applications in economics, physics, whatever. And so this is not to deny the applicability of mathematics in other areas. It's just that you might also think that the natural numbers, they're about something unique. And so similarly, someone who thinks that there's a determinate answer as to the question whether CH is true might think, actually, people who study ZFC plus CH and people who study ZFC plus not CH are doing something very useful because only one of them is true or correct, and sooner or later we'll find out which one of them that is by seeing it. We add new axioms somehow. At some point we come across inconsistency. This shows that ZFC, let's say, plus not CH was the wrong one, and then ZFC plus CH was the right one.
Oh, I see what you mean. I think I see what you mean. You say, that in contrast to what I was asserting, namely that it is difficult for the person who believes in the existence of a true V to explain why mathematicians are happy to develop systems like ZFC plus CH, ZFC plus not CH. This is not difficult at all, you say, because this type of activity, even for the person who believes in the true V, at a later stage might prove useful somehow. Is that what you're saying?
Not even just at a later stage, but now it's very useful because we want to find out which one of these is the right one and which one of them is wrong. And by having more people study each of these respective systems, we're more likely to find out, to come across inconsistencies.
I see.
I'm sorry, I really need to cut it off, otherwise people won't get the metro back to town. Can you just give a very quick answer?
Okay, well, ZFC is independent, you know, ZFC is independent, of course. I mean, CH is independent of first order ZFC. So, yes, you can gain quite interesting information by doing these particular things. But for the person who believes that some of the two is greatly mistaken in what he's doing, although we don't know who is at the present moment making the mistake, independently from the contingency of time. So we now don't know, nobody has yet discovered the principle which will decide it. Well, let's develop these systems and gain as much information as we can, okay? But we should not look at mathematical activity from the realist point of view, with this type of contingency in mind, okay? One of the two attitudes, and I finish with this, I'm sorry, if, perhaps I've not answered you properly. One of the two is profoundly mistaken, and yet, if you look at this type of activity from an historical point of view, this has proved to be immensely fruitful, okay? So there is no philosophical explanation, but the mathematical practice has shown that developing these things is a good thing for mathematics.
Okay, let us thank all three.